You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Home Field Apparel.
Welcome back to CrimsonCast. Galen, Scott Caulfield joining you on another victorious Sunday for IU football. The Hoosiers are 4-0 as they wax Charlotte at Memorial Stadium yesterday. We're going to talk about that game and talk about where the team looks like they are here at the third waypoint of the season. 4 games down, 8 regular season games to go. And Scott, we again find ourselves in the position of trying to put into words what we're experiencing with this IU football team in a good way. We've had plenty of seasons where we've had to find words for things not going our way. And thus far, everything's kind of gone Indiana's way so far. It's a refreshing change.
Yeah, let's not talk about it. So we'll just end the podcast. I don't want to jinx anything. So thank you guys for joining Upland Beer, Home Field Apparel. We're a little bit nervous. We'll see you guys next week. No, it is. It's wild. Because it's not only good, it's that they're confident, and it really feels like there's better times ahead with this team, because it feels like they're really trying to clean up mistakes. Yeah. And all of these wins are things that we just haven't seen in a while. So no, it's unreal. We're about to hit some rarefied air. We'll talk about with the schedule and what could be happening, but it is it's unbelievable. And I knew I was part of the problem. I mean, our kids had like 3 soccer games this weekend. We could not make it down. We're being down there next weekend. So I had to watch the game on TV, but it was like a second half Signetti love fest. Like, they were just showing all of these stats, all of these clips. Like, his winning percentage among college coaches is like right up there in the top 5. It was just like all Signetti all the time, and it was awesome. I just mainlined it. It was fantastic.
I'll have to go back and watch that. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah.
Before we dive in, just a reminder, folks, we are part of the Back Home Network, which contains a suite of shows covering IU athletics and beyond. Of course, we've got our friends over at Assembly Call, who will be kicking it fully into gear for basketball coming up here in a couple of weeks. They actually just had a nice breakdown of the revealed Big Ten schedule for IU. So go check that out. That was recorded earlier this past week. We've also got the Doing the Work podcast, which covers the IU women's basketball program. We've got just a variety of different shows on the Back Home Network. You can find them all at the Back Home Network YouTube channel, and also through the Discord that the Back Home Network utilizes for our fans and our friends to stay in touch with each other. The entire network brought to you by Home Field Apparel, your place to go for the finest in college fashions, the softest fabrics, the coolest designs. And, we mentioned this last week, Scott, just the amount of Home Field apparel out there in California, and then coming back to Bloomington, I just see it all over the place now. Like, this was kind of parents' weekend for fraternities and sororities. And it felt like every family had at least one person wearing something from Home Field Apparel, and rightfully so. Just an awesome array of everything, from T-shirts to long sleeve shirts to 3/4 shirts to crew necks to hoodies. We're not quite at hoodie season yet, but we're getting there. You can be a part of the army of Home Field Apparel wearers. Go to homefieldapparel.com. Get 15% off your first order if you use the code HOME23. Again, HOME23. Sign up for their newsletter. They have all kinds of cool drops and other interesting things that they will send out. Get on their text message thread, as they regularly send out deals right to your phone. Go check all of that out. Again, homefieldapparel.com for the finest in college fashions. Also, just a reminder, we are brought to you by Hoosier Game Day Lager, brought to you by the Upland Brewing Company. Upland really outdid themselves with Hoosier Game Day Lager. Not just the design of the can, that beautiful candy striped can that you'll see all over Memorial Stadium and all through the tailgate areas, but also just the flavor of the beer, a nice Vienna lager, very easy drinking. Scott, we enjoyed some at the tailgate yesterday, enjoyed a little bit while I was in the stadium. Just a really nice, easy drinking beer, and the official craft beer of IU athletics. So go find Hoosier Game Day Lager wherever you're buying beer in central and southern Indiana. Go to any of Upland's fine locations. And, of course, you can find it in Memorial Stadium at pretty much all of the concession stands. Please drink responsibly. Again, Hoosier Game Day Lager by Upland Brewing Company. Scott, let's dive into the fun Indiana wins this game 52-14 over Charlotte. We talked a little bit, well, not you and me, but we talked, with other people this week about the idea that, it's a good thing coming off that big emotional win in the Rose Bowl that IU had somebody other than a Big Ten opponent to play the next week. Like, it was really, you worried a little bit about a letdown. You worried a little bit about, a situation where maybe the emotion isn't quite there after as well as they played. And that was kind of how it played out early. Like, Indiana looked a bit flat. They go out to the 10-0 lead. You never felt like Indiana was ever in danger in this game, but it did feel like kind of a stodgy game for about the first 25 minutes or so of game action. And a little bit of concern, a little bit of buzz in the stands when Charlotte scores to make it 17-14. But then Indiana scores 2 touchdowns in the last, 5 minutes of the first half. And from there, it's just off to the races. Just a really, after a bit of a slow start, and Kurt Cignetti even noted that it wasn't like an awful start in the post-game press conference, but that they were a little bit slow and maybe not as detail-oriented, but a very professional way for this team to address the shortcomings they had out there. They put together basically a complete second half where they scored 21 points and Charlotte scored nothing. They end up they've almost doubled them up in total yards, and just a really nice kind of team performance without a whole lot of great individual statistical performances from this IU team.
Yeah, so 2 things off of that. With Charlotte, if you take out their 2 drives where they scored touchdowns, that's 150 yards. It takes their yardage from 156 to like 106. So, and not that you can start cherry picking this stuff. You take this out, take that out, but it's like that was those 2 drives were kind of the outliers, and then the rest of when you look at the drive chart for Charlotte, it's like 8 yards, 15 yards, 1, -2, 152, but then 4, -2, -4, 37. So for the most part, Indiana's defense held straight. They just had 2 drives where things didn't work correctly, and then you see like the course correction. Yeah. The other piece is, in your preview podcast this week, you were talking about kind of how interchangeable some of the pieces are. And that's what I was thinking about going into this game. And then, as you said, like, there's not really an individual standout. Again, the yardage for rushing is kind of all across the board. The yardage for receiving is all across the board. And I don't want to be too hyperbolic here, because it's like we are just starting this out. But as I think back, it's interesting how many IU teams that I can think of that were good or not good seem to be built around kind of singular stars, which is such an odd way to do it at Indiana, where you're just not going to get a lot of hot. You get some talent, you get some things that fall through the cracks, but like IU football isn't going to get there with like singular talent. Like, we're not going to get the Michael Vick, but you think back to like we had the Antoine Randall era when you and I went there. It's like that's all kind of we had, and then some of those teams under Hepner and Lynch, like they were good, but then Lynch kind of got like James Hardy as the receiver. Even those Kevin Wilson teams that were good, it's like Tevin Coleman or Jordan Howard. Even the good Tom Allen teams, like you have Michael Penix. And this is not to disparage anybody on the team or to say Rourke's not at that level. It's just we're playing a system. It's like everyone's within that system and everybody's interchangeable, and it looks so much better and so harder to stop. Whereas before, it's like, all right, can we just bottle up Tevin Coleman? It's like, oh, we did that. Great. Like that's all. And then, you saw this under Allen, where if somebody, one of those good players goes down, then it's like, oh, we have to fundamentally change how we're running our entire offense, because now we don't have the threat that was, X, Y, or Z. It's just here kind of in a good way, next man up. He's like, no, we're just going to keep running our system. So I was struck by that going in. And then during the game, it's unbelievable how everybody's kind of able to do everything, and not that we're totally unstoppable. And it makes this team so much better. And you take a step back, it's like, yes, this is how a team like Indiana football needs to give it. That's what Iowa does. Iowa doesn't normally have standouts. They just kind of build a program. And it's amazing that Cignetti was able to do that with the ashes of a 3-9 team and the transfer portal and get it done seemingly so quickly.
He made a comment in his post-game comments about how, he felt like the team, I'm paraphrasing here, but, kind of felt like the team had really learned lessons. He made a particular comment about, we certainly have a lot of high character guys on the team, which is interesting because, one of the things that we heard a bit during summer was there were some guys that maybe weren't buying in to the system. And, it doesn't seem like that's a problem. And, he really seems very satisfied with where the team is at overall so far through 4 games. And, obviously you've yet to play like a dominant opponent, but most teams in the country have not played a dominant opponent. And I have been really impressed with just how consistently this team plays. I talked about this when I was talking with Rhett Lewis a couple of days ago. It's like this team just doesn't get rattled. Now they, and again, they haven't really been rattled too much, or they haven't played teams that would rattle them. But even in this kind of a game, you find these miniature moments of adversity. I hate adversity in sports. It's one of the most overplayed things. But you had this pocket where it's like, hey, we're only up 3 and it's the second quarter, and the Charlotte team's on their 3rd string quarterback, and it's like there's no panic. They go back out, they go down the field, they drive, they score a touchdown, they score another touchdown, and then it's like, what were we worried about again? So it is refreshing. It's also weird for us as IU fans, because I think you really bring up a good point. Like so much of Indiana's history has depended on stars kind of exceeding their station in college football and dragging the rest of the team with them. There's only been a couple of circumstances where it's felt like that wasn't the case. The 2016 team kind of felt that way in that, 2015, it's like if Nate Sudfeld's not the quarterback, like we saw what that team looked like, right. And it was the previous year's team that went 4-8, and so I just look at it and I say, Indiana has always struggled to recruit complementary pieces, depth pieces, pieces that are, solid Bs that you can plug in on both offense and defense. And that seems like exactly the type of player that Kurt Cignetti went out and got. And I think the guys that stuck around deserve a lot of credit because, there was clearly latent talent on this roster and it needed augmenting by having new people come in. It's interesting to watch this alchemy happening. And it's interesting, as we talked about at the beginning of the year before any games are played, like this team finding its legs, finding its identity. And I don't think any of us thought, Scott, that the offense was going to be the identity of this team. But I mean, the offense has been incredible. Like, what are your thoughts there?
I think I think the defense has also been good, but no, I think the offense has been unbelievable. I mean, you look at the offense. Well, the last thing I do want to hit with your discussion with Rhett in relation to this game too, is I'm stealing your line from that podcast, but you were talking about how how many times we're going to keep moving the goalposts with this team, where you mentioned, like the competition has been somewhat subpar, and that's the feeling. But it's like you go and look and like, well, yesterday UCLA is putting up a real fight against LSU in LSU, and they ended up losing, but it's like they were up 17-14 for most of that game. It's like, all right, maybe UCLA doesn't suck. Like if they had, they didn't, but it's like that changes to me the view. I mean, if those games swap the way that they happen, if we had that UCLA game first and then we played UCLA, it's like going into the UCLA game, like, man, I'm scared of them because they almost beat LSU and LSU. It does feel like just people keep, and I guess it is what it is, just keep kind of, minimizing everything that we've done. But no, when you look at the offense, I know I always screw up the name of the game, but like the name the chart, name the drive.
Recite the drives. Come on.
Drive, and I'll get it in 5 years. My memory will get better. You start the game with touchdown, field goal, touchdown, 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 touchdown. And then you get a punt. And by that time, you're up and you have backups in. The offense has been electric. I think, I'm going to screw up the numbers. We've scored so far this year. Let me get the right one here. We've scored 231 points.
202.
202.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry. Wow. Okay. 202. To give you an idea, like in I had the wrong year up. 2020, the entire year in 8 games, we scored 231. Like my wife was adding up, like the last time we scored this many points, like in a season, we've outscored seasons pretty close in just 4 games. And what the thing is, for as electric, we can come back to the offense, as electric as it's been and how it's been so spread out everywhere. I still kind of feel like the calling card of this team might be the defense, because the defense has also been really good. You give up 14 to Charlotte. That's not awesome. But, you look around college football, Ohio State beat Marshall 49-14. No one's like, oh my God, does Ohio State have problems? Like I continue to always go back. Like these are the kinds of scores and games and the way things look when a team is really, really good. And, I mean, Penn State won 56-0. Like, that's a bit of that. But we had one like that, too. That was Kent State. That was, we had a 77-3. But it's like, I look at that Ohio State Marshall game. It's just like, these are scores. Like, other teams are going to get some stuff done. But no, the offense has been unbelievable. And again, Curtis Rourke is awesome.
Yeah.
And he really stirs it. And if he wasn't there, I think it would not work as well. But that's life in football, man. Like, you need a quarterback, and that's just the way things go. But everything else, it feels like it really is anybody's a threat at any time. And there really is this push and pull that I haven't felt with IU football in years. Even, under Wilson, it was always kind of running was the attack. And then under Allen, it was definitely throwing was the attack. This is the first time where it feels like, with UCLA, they were stopping the run. It's like, fine, we'll start passing. And then this game against Charlotte, I feel like they opened up a lot of the passing plays and a lot of that. And it's like, but we still have this run that can come in and average 4 yards a carry. It feels very multidimensional, of which I can't remember the last time I felt like Indiana really had that going.
I know. To give you an example, you and the listeners, an example of some of the stat breakdowns that are really fascinating. So you mentioned, like, so far this season, Indiana has scored 202 points, and they've allowed 37. Last year, through 4 games, Indiana scored 87 points and had surrendered 78 through 4 games. 2022, Indiana scored 115 points, but had given up 117. So, again, I don't know what to do with all this competence. Through 4 games, Indiana has scored 18 running touchdowns or 18 rushing touchdowns, depending on what you want to say. So
the year we didn't score any of them. Remember that year in the Big Ten, we were like keeping track of that?
Well, hold on. So 18 touchdowns on the ground through 4 games. Last year, through the entire 12 games, Indiana scored 13 touchdowns on the ground. The previous year, they scored 15 touchdowns on the ground. The previous year, 2021, they scored 13. Like, you got to go back to 2019 to have a whole season where Indiana scored that much on the ground. They had 24 rushing touchdowns in 2019.
Feels like we're going to break that in 2 games.
So, and everything that you look at, or everything I've seen so far, has really just the difference that we're seeing in terms of how well Indiana's playing and what they've been able to do so far, really on both sides of the ball, it's one of those where it's hard to get your head wrapped around it. And yeah, the goalpost moving, I get it. We're kind of pre-programmed as IU football observers and fans to keep thinking that what we're being shown is in some way fraudulent, because there have been situations like that in the past. But, what I would say is that when you point to other programs and you're looking at, this team's 4-0 or this team's, played really well, it's like, well, your team's doing the same thing against the same type of competition, and arguably doing it better. I mean, I think Indiana was the first FBS team to eclipse the 200 points scored mark of any team in FBS this year. That's the kind of thing that you need to take into account. It's fine to say, well, let's see what Indiana does against like big level competition, but frankly, when you look at the schedule, there aren't a whole lot of teams like that. And if Indiana wins, 8, 9, 10, 11 games, and then loses 1 game against a good opponent, that doesn't mean that they weren't good. It just means that, okay, they're in an echelon now where you don't have to keep making excuses or finding ways to not enjoy what's happening. My message in all of this, to myself, to you, to the people listening, is enjoy this, because this is such a rare set of occurrences to watch IU football being this dominant in all phases of the game. I mean, we may not see something like this again for another decade. So I would just say enjoy while you can, regardless of what the competition level is in your mind.
Again, I agree 1,000,000%. Like, I was thinking back to the 95 Northwestern team that went to the first team for them to go to the Rose Bowl in years. Do you remember where their strength of schedule was in the Big Ten that season? Like, no. You remember they went to the Rose Bowl and they had a fantastic season and it kickstarted things, and you went from there. And I mean, this is what I've been telling people who give me that schedule talk, is just, it's like, who cares? Like, don't care. At
this point, I put this on Twitter last night. If Indiana was Michigan, if everything was the same, the performances were the same, everything, but it was Michigan's uniforms on Indiana's bodies, they would be
national championship.
They would be ranked they would be ranked. I said ranked 9th. They'd probably be ranked higher than that. Like, that is, this is how football works. And IU has been kind of on the bottom of the barrel for so long, like fighting and clawing to get to a point where they're playing really well. And I mean, we saw Nebraska is a great example. I put it was kind of a joke post earlier up this week, but it's like, well, compare what Nebraska's done and compare what Indiana's done in terms of the quality of the opponent, the level of the victories in terms of margin, the way that they played. Like, there's really no argument going into this week for Nebraska to be ranked and Indiana not to be ranked, other than Nebraska has a brand that voters are dying to rank, and Indiana everybody is suspicious of because Indiana is Indiana. Now Nebraska turns around and loses at home to Illinois. I mean, will they still be receiving votes? Probably. Well, I mean, if Indiana were to do the same thing, they probably would drop completely out of the poll and never be seen again. On the one hand, I don't care about those things, and I'm not really worried about it. But I did want to note that if you're, don't grade your own team on a curve, Indiana fans. Like, don't grade your own team based upon this perception that they're not achieving something, when the salutes that we give to other teams who are 3-0, 4-0, having these good statistical performances are coming against the exact same types of opponents in most cases. So just give yourself some grace if you're an IU football fan, and give your program some grace as well.
Well, it's also been so long that we've had a schedule like this where we're playing a full Big Ten schedule, and it still looks like smooth sailing for quite a long time. Like, you keep saying, top level opponents, and you look at our schedules, like, I don't know where that is. Like, I mean, it's definitely Ohio State. It's probably still Michigan. They look like they have some life left. Outside of that, it doesn't look like there's a lot of teams that, would be favored to beat Indiana. And I think that's also what's at play here is people are so used to, like, oh, you get the Big Ten, and it's brutal. It's like, well, it can be, but every so often the chips can fall in such a way where it's not brutal, and it's not brutal this year. I think your point about, the uniforms is totally valid, because I continue to go back to saying that, like, the way we beat UCLA, that's what a good team does. The way we just beat Charlotte, like, it's almost the exact same score as Ohio State had this weekend, but everyone's going to view it differently. But I am with you. What this team is doing, it's very workmanlike. You hear the way Cignetti talks about it, and it's exactly the way I want my coach to talk. He, in both the halftime interview and the post game on TV broadcast, it was like, at halftime, he's like, man, we got some things to work on. Like, it's all right, but we got a lot to work on. Even after the game, he's like, hey, it's okay. Like, that wasn't great. We had the 2 drives we lost. Like, it is very, I'm striving for perfection, and I'm not super happy with where we're at. I'm not going to be excited about it. And that's also a place we haven't been in a while. The rarefied air that I'm looking at is, and it's wild to think this, the last time we had a 5-0 start. And, we've played hundreds of seasons, and a lot of those seasons we've played garbage opponents, good opponents.
Yep.
I know that you know the answer to this, but Galen, I'll just ask you this. How many seasons in the history of Indiana football has Indiana gone 5-0?
Oh, geez. I'd actually, believe it or not, I don't know this one off the top of my head, but I'm going to guess that it's like 4 seasons in history.
So, and if I'm wrong, I was scanning through the data pretty quickly this morning. I have 3.
Okay.
1967, 1945, and then 1910.
Yeah.
And like, I didn't do the math. There's probably more seasons than not that we haven't won 5 games hard stop. Like, no starts. Oh, like, that is what, this is where it's like, okay, you can talk all you want about soft schedules and bad teams. Like, we've played, Division II or whatever it's called now, like, every year. We've played a lot of, there've been a lot of years we've had soft schedules. That's over 100 years of football. Yeah. To be doing something only for the 4th time is pretty unbelievable. And that's what's the precipice that we have right now, is having a 5-0 start, which is like, that's where it's like, all right, if we're doing something that's only been done 4 times, you can't just start saying like, oh, well, this and that. It's like, no, like, every year there's all those things are still there, and we haven't been able to do this for so long. We are really in kind of rarefied territory, which is kind of wild to think.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking through, and I think you've nailed it. There was one season, and it doesn't count because it wasn't 5-0, but in '88 they went 5-0-1 in their first 6 games, but they were 4-0-1 in their first 5, which, again, a tie is not a victory. I learned that in math class at one point.
Well, I was even thinking like, oh, 2020's got to be in there. It's like, no, they were 4-0 and then lost to Ohio State.
Right.
And, yeah.
So yeah, I think that's the message, from me and certainly from you. It's just like, there's a chance to do something really extraordinary here. And look, the competition does ramp up. This is a different level. Cignetti rightly talked about in his post-game press conference, like we've got to maintain focus. Can't afford distractions at this point. We've got to maintain focus. And that's going to be ultimately kind of the message here over these next few games. And this next game against Maryland is going to be a really fascinating one because they're two teams that look relatively even in terms of the statistics. Maryland has been fine so far this season. They obviously they had that loss at home against Michigan State, but they bounced back and played really well on the road against what I think is a decent Virginia team. But they have not been as dominant as Indiana has so far. And so it'll be a really interesting case because as we talked about with that UCLA game, and as we saw with UCLA, in this game against LSU this week, like that's not a complete dumpster fire of an LSU or a UCLA team. Like they have talent, they can play hard. So what I'm really fascinated with is, okay, now you've got a group of guys on this IU team who have demonstrated that they can play at a high level, and they've been able to maintain a focus and a consistency in all of these games so far. Like the one exception is the first game, the FIU game, which is you go back and you think about it, you're almost disappointed that they didn't win by more, but it was clear at that point, I think, and you and I talked about this even in the post-game press conference for that one, that this team was trying to figure some things out about itself, and they really do look like they've figured out even more. Like this game will look like a team that after they got over some early struggles really was hitting on all cylinders. And I'm really excited about the fact that there, as we've talked about many times, there does appear to be another plateau that this team can hit. They've been very effective. They haven't used a whole lot of the passing game. They used it in the UCLA game, but they've reverted back to the run when they've needed it. They've got this kind of rotating committee of backs that seem to do very well. They have a central figure in defense and Aiden Fisher, who's leading the team in tackles, but then they've got like a bunch of guys who are right behind who have done a really good job. And, I think overall, as this IU team continues to hone itself and starts to get against better competition, it really is going to be about a focus thing at this point, because on paper, both in terms of the talent levels and in terms of the results, their next four opponents, Maryland this next week, Northwestern the week after that, and then Nebraska and Washington in back-to-back weeks. They're all winnable. I watched that whole Nebraska game. Like that is not an unbeatable Nebraska team, as Illinois very deftly showed. And that's going to be in Memorial Stadium. It is going to, I think, take
one more to that, at Michigan State after Washington. So
yeah. So now will Indiana win all of those games? I don't know. They could. And if you look at what the computers look at, again, they're going to project Indiana to win all 5 of those games, which is pretty wild to think about.
Darling Indiana football.
You look right now, Indiana, so Bill Connolly just updated his S&P Plus rankings. Indiana's 30th in S&P Plus now after 4 weeks. And this is a team that started in, the 80s?
Right.
And this is still at a point where some of the last year's stuff is still being factored in. So it's it's a very tight world in college football right now. But if you look at Indiana, they're ranked 43rd in offensive S&P Plus. They're 33rd in defensive S&P Plus, and they're 6th in special teams, largely because they haven't used the special teams. And when they do have to use them, they've got really good guys out there to do it, whether that's James Evans or whether that's the kicking group. And you look up and down at this point, like Indiana looks like one of the more balanced teams that's out there. And that is going to, I think, play very well. Like if you look at the combo of them and Maryland coming into this next week, what's interesting is like Maryland is not that far away in terms of their S&P Plus ranking. I think Maryland is like 35th, so they're right behind IU. But they're a couple of points below them in the ranking. Their offense is only 65th in the country. Their defense is 28th, so their defense is slightly better, but their offense is worse. Like that's the kind of balance that Indiana is going to be able to strike, I think, moving forward will really serve them well, because they're not going to lean too much on one or another phase of the game, which, you go back, Scott, to some of the previous years, those Kevin Wilson teams lean so heavily on their offense to do everything and kind of carry the defense. And that's not exactly what's happening here. It feels like both sides of the ball can kind of carry their own weight with this stuff.
Yeah, I totally agree. the thing that I thought was interesting, the play that I'm going to kind of highlight from this Charlotte game, just I think it kind of makes this point, is it was a catch by Sam West, who had his first catch, I think, of the season. But it was this like nice play that opened up, and he ran like a little hook, like a wheel route on the side, and was just wide open, tons of free range to go. Had one catch for 37 yards. And it's one of those where, like, in previous years, I think we would have had that, and like we would have talked all about it in the podcast. Like, where does he fit in? Like, can we start getting him more touches? And we haven't talked about any of that. And it's nothing against Sam West. I mean, I hope he has a great season, but it's not like, oh my God, we got to feed that guy more, do more. It's like, no, it's just that's a functional football program where you have a wide receiver out there who's, when he's open, and he'll get a couple touches, and he's growing into his role. And it was a beautiful play. And that's the thing from this offense that I still kind of keep going back to. And it's very hard to quantify, but it just feels like there's a lot of the playbook we haven't seen. Because there are these moments where you see these plays where it's like, holy crap, that was a really nice play to really get somebody open. And then we'll kind of go back to like, 5 or 6 RPOs, and not in a bad way because it's working. Whereas in previous years, it felt like we would do that, but go back to like run up the middle. And then it's like 2nd and 9, 3rd and 7, and then we punt. This is like we kind of go back to the vanilla offense, but the vanilla offense is leading us with touchdowns and field goals. And it's just something that I feel that like, I really feel like there's a whole second playbook we haven't even touched yet. That's kind of like, let's just wait until things really get hairy. And you see it in these moments of these games where it's like, Charlotte has 14 points. Like, all right, let's make sure we score the next 2 times. And we do. And that's something that I've not felt. And then the defense, the same thing. It has these moments where, they don't lose judgment, but it's just, the other team is able to do some things like, all right, let's immediately make some adjustments and come back. And then you can kind of feel the defense just kind of boa constrictoring out these things. And I know we bitched everybody for caveating, I'll caveat like, yes, the opponents have not been the highest level, but I mean, we did it against UCLA, and that's all we can say we've done it against. And I'm with you. You look at Maryland, like when you look at like Pro Football Focus, they're right there. The overall teams, Illinois is highest ranked in the Big Ten, and then Indiana, and then Iowa, then Maryland. So, I mean, they seem to be right kind of where we're at. I think it's going to be a really interesting test. Anyway, yeah, those are my thoughts. Yeah.
Some interesting notes. Excuse me. A little too much yelling at the game yesterday in a happy way. So Colin McMahon from Indiana Rivals had an interesting tweet. IU, so we just got the betting line. So they just opened it as a 5.5 point favorite for the Maryland game.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Vegas, by the way, all this not taking note, like Vegas has taken note.
Yeah, Vegas is like, oh, look, I mean, the spread was 29, I think, yesterday.
We're a favorite on the road at UCLA. We're opening as a 5.5 point favorite. I mean, like Vegas doesn't. This is why Vegas doesn't lose money. They actually notice these things in teams. Yeah,
it's going to be really fascinating watching the momentum build on this, because as you mentioned, so Indiana right now fifth. This is again from Colin McMahon's tweet, ranked 15th in FPI, which is ESPN's metric. They have the 14th best chance to make the playoff of any team at 27.4%. Indiana's 5th in average points per game scored and 7th in points allowed per game in FBS. I mean, this is nuts, like all of this. And again, it's like Indiana's got to play up to that level now. They're not going to sneak up on people for much longer. And people are going to take them more seriously. The execution is going to be more and more important. But again, we went through another game with this IU team where they didn't commit a turnover. Right now, Indiana's turnover margin on the season is +7. They've the last time they had a +7 turnover margin, I think again was 2020. They had a +8 turnover margin that year. And it's, they only forced one fumble for Charlotte. But what I'm most impressed by is they continue to not make self-owns. They're not putting themselves in a position where they provide the other team with a lot of great momentum. They're not killing their own drives with turnovers. Now that will end at some point, and I'll be curious to see how this team handles that. But I know it just sounds like we're just showering the team with praise here over and over again. But I feel like that's deserved, Scott, at this point. And I'm just really excited. Like, you run down the list, and you see what Indiana's been able to do. It's been really, really heartening that they've been able to move the ball as well as they have, and then their defense has been able to shut down opponents. I mean, again, it's just like we see teams that have really good defenses that don't score a lot. We see teams that have good offenses that have a hard time, keeping the other team from scoring. There just aren't a lot of teams, even against poor competition, that do both of those things well. So,
the two things are, I feel like we've spent the last couple of, we're allowed to do this because we've spent the last couple of years, 2021, we were both excited. And I think you and I both pretty early season, we were like, something's wrong here. Like we tried to bring that on the podcast. The last 2 years, we've been kind of fighting this, like very early on, the statistics have been awful for Indiana. And you and I have kind of been playing, Danger Will Robinson most of the season, the last 2 seasons, just kind of being like, hey, I don't know how this gets better.
Right.
And we were really pessimistic the last 2 years and took a lot of grief for it. And I feel like everything is reversed this year. It's a complete 180 where, I still talk to a lot of people. People go to games. They're just like, I don't know. We'll see. It's like they're kind of waiting for that moment. And it's like it's all there. And what's weird is we're a stat darling. Like we're one of those teams in like Ken Palm that's just like, man, this team is like they figured out the analytics system and they're the great darling. I would say this, and so again, soccer games last week. I apologize for not making it to the game yesterday, but this is the moment I do feel like where we've always had this push and pull of fans need to show up. The team has to show up first for the fans. Like I feel like we are at that moment now where this team has done enough and justified like this game against Maryland should be a complete sellout. And it should be people fired up. Like this is the moment where it's like, all right, now you have a real Big Ten opponent. You have a team that has some real things that they could do in Indiana. You're about to hit some pretty historical benchmarks if you start winning and continue to win. This is the moment where it feels like, things should turn. So that's my push to any fan is like, now's the time to get in for students. Like these are the games to start staying the whole time, to show up early. Like this is where we need to step up and bring Memorial Stadium at 100% capacity. And like this is the moment.
And look, it was disappointing. I thought the crowd yesterday, people just gotta show up. I mean, there's always, and look, I get it. No one has been on this IU football train longer than you and I have, just in terms of like fandom. There are older fans certainly, right. But I guess my point is we don't keep hopping on and off as a lot of people do. And we've seen seasons where people were not that excited or the team wasn't that exciting. There's just a weird kind of hesitancy, it feels like, amongst a lot of people. Like it was hot yesterday at the game. It was not blazing. Like it wasn't that bad. I mean, I've as I was saying to somebody, like I used to go to games in the Orange Bowl when I worked at Miami. I mean, that was hot. It was 10 degrees hotter and 20% more humid at LSU yesterday. And
the Big Ten Network though, because the way they showed the coach Biff, which is just like the greatest coach name, like he looked like he was hot.
Yeah.
Like the sweat running down the little aerator. Like every time they showed him, I was like, man, that looks brutal. But I think it was more a Biff problem than anybody else.
Yeah, I know. That was the pictures from that particular situation defy a lot of mental items that I have in my brain right now. But
wearing like a hat that was too small with like a beanie with a cord coming out. It's like Biff.
Very odd. But look, there's plenty of people who can't come to games because they don't live close enough, and we appreciate you folks. This is one, and again, it's like I'm not paid to get people to go to the games or anything like that, but I just don't know what people are waiting for. Like if it's like, oh, well, what to see you play a real team, as you said a few weeks ago, it's like part of the fun is going in and watching your team like really dominate. I mean, this is part of the process. This is what you say that you want. And, I think to some degree, I remember like this is it's a problem with the IU fan base that doesn't happen often, but because obviously Indiana's rarely been good, but it's almost like when the novelty of the football team being good wears off, people decide that they're going to not come. And we saw this actually even at the height of Indiana's biggest string of success in the late 80s and early 90s. And, this is one of those things that people forget, but like, the attendance went through the roof in 87, in 88, in 89, and then it slowly started to drop off. And, there were games at the start of the 93 season when Indiana, they went 8-4 that year. They were in the hunt for the Big Ten title. They were coming off a season where, they had barely missed a bowl, but I think they had won like 8 games, 5 games, 7 games, and 5 games in 4 years. This is a good team. Attendance dropped to like 30,000 at the beginning of that season. And they didn't have a sellout that year. It dropped further in 94. I can remember listening to Don Fisher and Max Skirvin on broadcasts at the time, and bowl games were like kind of put off from IU because there's like, well, their fans don't travel anymore. Now, we know that that's not the case now, but it's interesting going back and looking at those attendance numbers and how quickly everything fell off as soon as it was like old hat that the IU football team was good. Here, it's like the opposite issue where it's like they haven't really gotten people into the mix yet with IU football. And I'm just waiting, like, is there going to be a trigger where people are like, yes, this is actually a really fun team. It's a dominant team. It's a team we're going to watch. I mean, on paper, the attendance was fine yesterday. It was about 1,000 less than FIU. In person, there were clearly not that many people there. And given that it was a noon game and it was a beautiful day, a little bit hot, but still a beautiful day outside, that was disappointing. I just, you're probably right in that you probably will have a lot more people at this Maryland game. I think the get-in price last night for the game was something like $43, which is generally a pretty good sign that tickets are getting harder and harder to come by. But then today, the get-in prices dropped to $34. So it's like there's clearly not the demand yet on behalf of IU fans to go and watch this team. I just wonder, does that get triggered? It feels like it should have triggered by this point, because are people really going to be that much more fired up for Maryland than they were for, just going to a game in general? I mean, that's not exactly a big name opponent in the big scheme of things.
My hope is that it's a big, being a Big Ten team always does seem to raise attendance, even a bad Big Ten team. Rutgers normally brings it a little bit more than some of our, bad non-conference opponents. But I'm with you. I've kind of looked at this moment as like, this should be the triggering moment. And it's also because of the runway you have ahead of us. You have ahead of you. It's not like, all right, this is a mirage where now we got to play Oregon, Penn State, Ohio State, Michigan. It's like, no, we're about to hit a stretch of maybe the best weather you're going to have in Bloomington. And 3 of the next 4 games are at home, and your opponents are Maryland, Northwestern, Nebraska, and Washington. Yeah. And it's like, you could be going 3-1 in those games. Hell, they could go 4-0 in those games. Like, this is the moment, I think, where it has to be triggered. This is where you need to show up, and like, this is the moment for this team where, this is why you have a new coach. Like, all that talk of, man, 2020, and they just, shit the bed the next year. It's like, okay, but that was 4 years ago. That's a different coach, different scenario. Like, that's why you have new coaches. Like, this is all new. And it takes time to change how the ship goes, but it does feel like I think of like the Zach Osterman always talks about, a college football program is like a battleship or an aircraft carrier. It just takes forever to turn. It feels like we're not there. It feels like we just, like, Signetti just grabbed the guys, like, we're getting on this cutter and we're just gonna have a quick turn to the right. And it does feel like this is a different team. And you know what? If things are the same as before, let's go in and try it and get hurt. Like, I mean, I'm so in, but it just does not feel that way because of all the things that we've talked about and how all across the board this team is, how professional they look. I mean, the only thing that I could say that I would love to see cut out is we're still getting some penalties. Not as bad as it feels like in the past, but we're still racking up more penalty yards than we would like. I think like 290 for the season. So getting 3 or 4 penalties a game, it'd be nice to clean that up. But everything else has been just so workmanlike in these wins. But yet when they need to get exciting, they get exciting. Like, it's not a boring team. It's a fun team to watch, but it's also a team that like is professional and just takes care of business.
Yeah. Well, it should be fun watching what happens here moving forward. As the big thing is, it seemed like Indiana made it out of the game with no injury issues, and they continue to refine aspects of things. And to go on the run that they did, to go from 17-14 to 51-14. The other thing that was really interesting was Indiana 52-14. Sorry, was the final. Indiana had a couple of drives that probably should have resulted in touchdowns that didn't. You had the overthrow from Taven Jackson on that crossing pattern. There was another one like that. It almost felt like Indiana left a little bit out there, and they punted in the middle of the third quarter, I think it was, and it was like, this is a shock. I forgot what our punting unit looked like. So they continue to do little refinements. They probably could have won by a little bit more, and now they play certainly a team that's always been a good barometer for where Indiana's at in the old Big Ten. Maryland and Indiana, it was like only one of you can be good because you're in the Big Ten East and you've already got 3 losses, and you were seeing finally like, hey, that's the teams who have been freed from those shackles. Like there's 2 in particular, Rutgers and Indiana both, who look like they are, in a mode where it's like, wow, we no longer have to be locked into playing this awful schedule. We've got some flexibility. And it would be great if both of those teams would be able to take full advantage of it throughout the course of the season.
No, it's like wow, this is like letting a dog out in the farmlands. Like, wow, that's what the Big Ten West has been like. It's so nice. All these teams you don't have to play. I want to ask. Let's play a game. It's slightly not the Scott Fever dream game, but we're getting there. If we keep on winning, I think the answer is pretty simple, but just want to play it through.
Okay.
We keep winning. When do we get ranked? I think I have my answer, but because I looked through it today, like not enough teams in the lower 20s lost, so I don't think we're going to get ranked this week. And it's going. So when we keep winning, at what point do you think we get ranked?
If we're not ranked this week, I actually think we're going to be ranked like 25th this week.
Okay.
By the time this comes out, we'll see what happens. But if Indiana's not ranked this week, I think beating Maryland would rank them for the following week. And again, it'll either be right at the very edge. Actually, now that I'm looking at it, I think actually you're right. Because Nebraska's probably going to drop out of the rankings, and I'm guessing perhaps Illinois is already ranked. Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know. Beating Charlotte by that much probably didn't catch that many people's heads, but I do think I'll be fascinated to see what Indiana's ranking is, or their vote getting compared to, say, Iowa. And what happens with all the votes for people that voted for Syracuse, who of course then turned around and lost to Stanford on Friday. There's a bunch of teams where it's like, this may be good for IU, but there may be a little bit of a cap on it. But I think if they were to beat Maryland, surely there'll be some teams above them in the rankings that lost, and so I think it'll be right around either next week if they beat Maryland, or shortly afterwards. I don't think it's going to be a whole lot longer than that, though.
I don't know. I kind of looked at it as I think there's that national inertia, just kind of keep Indiana where it's at, and if there's not a ton of losses ahead of us, I think it could be as far as the Nebraska game, and beating Nebraska. We do that at that point now. So you're 7-0. You have a win against Nebraska, which, in the minds of voters, like that's actually something. Even though that may be one of the worst teams, maybe not the best Big Ten team we're going to play in our stretch. So I don't know. I think it could be that far, because I think this week we're still going to be in that others receiving votes. And then if we beat Maryland, I think that's something for us. But it's like I think it's going to have to be beating a team that is kind of a name. And I think we're going to continue to be other receiving votes. You beat Northwestern, it's like, all right, it's Northwestern. They're not playing a temporary. Like, there's a lot of ways you can push things off, but I do think once you get 7-0 with a Nebraska win, it's like, then you're probably going to pop into like the 19 range.
It's possible. I don't know. I wonder sometimes how often the pollsters or the voters think about what they're doing.
Right.
It's like, you look at the teams receiving, like Memphis was 26th in the poll, and they lost 56-44 at Navy. They should not be getting votes at all. Texas A&M, who was 25th in the poll, like they barely beat Bowling Green at home this week. Why would they be getting votes at this point? Like what have they done? What have they accomplished statistically? Nebraska, we already talked about. Northern Illinois, who was ranked, they turn around and lose to Buffalo. Well, they should not be ranked. That was an overreaction. So I do wonder. It's why I think perhaps in the AP poll, at least, it's a possibility even this week. It's just that you look around the lower reaches of things, and it's hard to really point to any of those teams and say they are definitively more accomplished than Indiana has been. All the statistics point towards Indiana being very good. And again, none of this matters. I don't care. I would prefer that we weren't ranked until later because I like flying under the radar with this team a little bit right now. But I could see the voters looking at it this week and saying, you know what, actually, it makes sense to rank Indiana.
I also want to we don't need to do it right now because it's totally unprepared. Didn't prep you for this, but it's like, I feel like in previous years, we didn't want to be too negative, but I think you and I both, in talking about it, we were mentally and off the record kind of updating our season win total projections. It's like, all right, this looks like it's going to be rough. I almost want to kind of have a redo of our win projections because it feels like 8 is a pretty solid number. Like, I feel like 9 could really be in play here, and it would be fun to kind of go through. It's just, again, this all goes to that feeling of I'm willing to buy in and really buy in with this team because you're just seeing a lot of things that I've just not seen before out of an Indiana team, and so much success, and then so much kind of confidence, like just so much quiet confidence, and not overextension by the staff. But it feels like there's something, I don't know. I almost want to redo and look and see if I can get us to 9 wins, because it does feel like now is a point where I could do a slight course correction, basically moving the goalpost, which is what I was bitching about earlier. So maybe we shouldn't do that.
Well, the thing is, ultimately, we actually, Zach Osterman and I were talking about this earlier this week on the Indy Star podcast, and it's like both of us independently felt like we pulled a punch in picking the win total, in that it felt like if things went right for Indiana, 9 wins was more in line than perhaps the 8. And, the 8 was, well, surely they're going to lose one of these in some way. And they still might. And that's the thing. It's like, look, there's a scenario where Indiana isn't ready to play against Maryland and loses that game. And, there's a scenario where Nebraska, rides an awesome Dylan Raiola performance and gets a good defensive performance, and they beat us on homecoming. There's certainly you lose
Washington, like we lose those games back to back.
Yeah, everybody's been like looking at Michigan and being like, "Ooh, that Michigan game looks suddenly really winnable." And it's like, well, the flip side is Michigan's defense is still awesome, even if their offense is not. And who knows how Indiana's offense is going to stand up, or how their offensive line is going to protect Curtis Rourke. And you look at the difference between Curtis Rourke and Taven Jackson and just the poise, and it's like you're one injury away. Which is why, I've been hesitant to dream bigger, I guess, not because I don't think Indiana, if everything goes right, couldn't win 9, 10 games, maybe even 11 games. It's more that, it's very difficult for everything to go right in a season. And, we talked about that with the 2020 season and how special that was. And it's like, wow, everything went right this season almost, except for Penix getting injured. You just don't get that often. And that's not just an Indiana thing. Like, that's just in general. Like, stuff goes wrong with football teams as you go along. And so that's why I'm not, Indiana's 4-0 right now. And the fact that Indiana's 4-0 right now means that they are only, 2 wins from being bowl eligible.
Which is nuts.
We talked about that, at the beginning of the season. And it was like, if you could get bowl eligible, then you're kind of just playing with house money the rest of the way. And it just feels to me like expecting that to happen without a hitch, which it kind of has. It's gone off without a hitch. Yeah. And then expecting IU to continue to play better and better every week, it's certainly possible. And I think Kurt Cignetti and his staff are figuring out, or already know, like, here's how we condition this team to think about a bigger level of accomplishment than they think that they're capable of. Because we kind of saw that with James Madison last year, and the way that they were in a very short period of time able to take that James Madison program and make them believe that they belonged in the national conversation. The foundation has been built really nicely, and clearly what they did in the offseason laid that foundation for this team playing within themselves, playing with confidence, achieving. Where I just get really interested is, how do you manage that transition from getting your team to believe in what it's doing to that next level where you go in expecting to win games, not taking them for granted, but feeling like you can play with anybody, which is such a huge part of what you have to do as a football team and what you have to do as a coach. That's where, they could win 9 games, 10 games, but I also just don't know quite where they're at mentally. What do they do in that first game against a team that really is throwing punches back at them? how do they manage all of that? Do they maintain the poise? What I've seen so far feels like they'll be able to, but I don't want to take it for granted. And at this point, it's like I'd hate to get myself, mentally thinking along the lines of, oh, of course we're going to win these games and then be disappointed. I feel like there's a bunch of people in the IU fan base or skeptics, the doubting Thomases of the IU fan base, who the line has been, well, gosh, they've just beaten bad competition up to this point. And I'm waiting for, Indiana to get good, to get ranked. They maybe lose a game, and people are like, well, see, we told you they weren't actually that good. And it's like, you must be a great person to have around at parties. This is the biggest straw man argument I think we've had on CrimsonCast historically, Scott. But this is the kind of thing where it's like, I don't want to.
They'll get to you're right. Like they could end the season like 7-5 and be like, oh, this team was supposed to go 11-1. Like, what'd you guys do? It's like, no, like this season, I think that is possible, and that's exciting to talk about, but hard stop after where we've been this season. If you can make a bowl, that's a success. It is. And if you can get to 6 wins, no matter when it happens, even if you get to 5 and then you got to beat Purdue to get to 6 and it takes that long, if you get to 6 wins and this team goes to a bowl, that's a great season. But I'm with you. You do feel like we could get to like 5-0, 6-0. And then if we, lose 4 or 5 in a row, it'll be like, oh, but what happened to this team? Oh, you guys are going to win the Big Ten. Now you're not. It's like, this is still a process of building a program. It's exciting to think about because it feels like it actually is there and is kind of possible to get there, but it doesn't change the fact that this team's goal this year is really just to make a bowl. And it feels like that is unbelievably attainable right now.
Yeah, I mean, it is the proof of concept for what Signetti and his staff are building. It's the thing that you're able to put in front of recruits, and ultimately, it's the thing you put in front of fans, and you get fans excited. If the argument is, I heard this from several people about the attendance thing. It's like, well, we don't come because we've been told that these teams are good before, and then they haven't been good. And I was like, that's your reason for not coming to the Charlotte game where Indiana was liable to win by 30 points and did. So look, I think there's always going to be that moving of the goalposts, and it's why I still feel good about the 8-win projection. It was above what the projections were statistically. As Rick Bozich points out on Twitter today, Indiana's projected win total is now 9.4. And so, look, again, 8 wins is right in that range. That would be an awesome target. I don't feel like revising. I think I would say that us and Osterman, the people that picked that many wins, it was always a best case scenario in terms of the team had to come together. We were taking it on faith, but everything that we saw coming in, it felt like this was the kind of team that we might see. I have just been so impressed with how consistently good they've been in so many different areas. It's really going to be fascinating to watch moving forward.
Yeah, I just looked at the weather. Unfortunately, it's going to be like slight showers on Saturday, like 78, 57 at night. It's going to be pretty, but it's like 50% chance of like some showers. So hopefully that blows over. But just bring a poncho and let's go have some fun.
That's right. I think it'll be fine. And never trust weather more than 2 days in advance is kind of the way I look at things.
Yeah.
Anyway, any final thoughts before we wrap up, Scott?
No, I mean, we're now getting into the meat of the schedule. And now is the point where I think a lot of these straw man arguments will fade away. And all I say is after 4 games, I'm just really impressed with what I've seen. And it's really nice to have Signetti at the helm. And this team has really taken on his personality in a very good way, where it just feels very workmanlike, getting things done, next man up. All the pieces are interchangeable. And for the first time in a while, it feels like we have a program. And I don't mean that we've had good seasons and, really high highs, but that always felt like it was predicated on, like I said earlier, kind of individual success that was very much focused on those people doing well. This really feels like this is a program shift and a real program where it's like, all right, we're playing Indiana.
Yeah.
I don't know who the wide receivers are. I mean, I do, but like, I don't know who the wide receivers are. I don't know who the running backs are, but like, I know what they're going to do. And that's very much like how I feel about like Wisconsin and Iowa. We play them year in, year out. It's like, I don't really know who the next players are in Iowa, but I know Iowa's not going to be running a West Coast offense with 5 out. Like, I know what Iowa's going to run. They know what they're going to run. And it's going to be just a lot of people who are going to come in and out doing exactly what Iowa wants to do. And it's just like, it's so cool to see that here at Indiana. And I think that's something that's really, really special so far.
It does. And that's the thing. Like, it feels sustainable in a way that, and it's weird to say, and it probably is a little hyperbolic. because it's only 4 games.
Yeah.
But what you see in the 4 games, you're like, this feels sustainable. And we know that the talent level on this team is not that you don't have the recruits that most of the teams in the Big Ten have, but this particular approach feels really sustainable. And I think it's, like you said, there's a programmatic feel to what has been established already. And just even the way the team is carrying itself, the way the coaches talk about it, the way the players talk about it, it just feels so different. And, look, and again, it's an interesting contrast to the previous coaches where, like Tom Allen, the program was really about him. I mean, you get right down to it, the whole thing, the LEO thing, that was him. That wasn't an organic thing. That was something he imposed. And that word sounds terrible, but it's really meant like it was his way of trying to create a culture.
Yeah.
Even the breakthrough stuff in the early stages, it was about, it was really a slogan as opposed to being like an endemic part of how we played football. Kevin Wilson, you never felt that. Like, you knew that there was a good offensive scheme somewhere, but it was always struggling with execution, it felt like.
Somewhere in there, I see it. Yeah.
And, and the times it would emerge, you'd be like, oh, that's what this is supposed to look like. And it rarely
under individual talent at running back.
Yeah. Bill Lynch didn't really have a program identity. Jerry DiNardo didn't really have a program identity. Hepner's program identity was like, well, I want you to be part of the IU football program. It was not dissimilar to what Tom Allen tried to do. And, Cam Cameron, there was not really an identity there. I mean, you go back to Mallory where they had a program identity and it felt like that was a sustainable thing. And it was for several years. That's the kind of thing I feel right now as we've watched these first 4 games under the Signetti era. And that is probably the hardest thing to get my head wrapped around is, like, as you said, whether it's an Iowa or a Virginia Tech or, some of these programs that have had clearly defined, like, here's what we do sort of approaches. It's been so long since Indiana had that. And we'll see how it goes against better competition and in the conference and how it stacks up. But it does feel like Indiana's hit upon something here that could be really special moving forward. I'm really fascinated to see how it blossoms.
Well, and also, I mean, the last thing I'll say is, we've showered Signetti with a lot of praise. But one of the graphics they showed in the game yesterday was, winning percentage by coaches with at least 5 seasons. And it's like Kalen DeBoer is up there at like 900%. And what's funny is we just all assume, oh, yeah, of course he's good. Like, he went to, Fresno State and just had one. It's like, well, that's what good coaches do. It's like, well, Signetti is like 2 percentage points behind Dabo Sweeney. And like, it's like, Kirby Smart, and like, it's like a list of like 7 people. And Signetti is right up there, like winning percentage of like 773 or something. And, if we weren't Indiana fans with all the baggage and everything we had, if this was just Northwestern or Iowa State, you'd be like, oh yeah, well, they hired a good coach. Like, of course they're going to be good. Like, he'll turn it around quickly. And that's what we saw with DeBoer in other places. I think that you just have to also take into consideration, like, Signetti is just a really good coach.
Yeah.
He is. And we have him. He's on our staff and he's doing it with our team. But we're probably not going to win all the rest of our games. We're probably not going to go 11-1 or 10-2, but that doesn't mean this is smoke and mirrors. Right. That like something is being built here, and no question, I'm very confident being right now. Like, I think if we don't make a bowl at this point, it would be very disappointing. I don't think that's going to happen. And even if we're not going to hit the rarefied air, it's like, if we get to 6, 7, 8 wins, it's a great season, but it's like you are seeing something happen here. And Signetti is a really good coach, and everything, the numbers and the play and everything backs it up. So that's the thing that I would tell fans who are a little bit hesitant is it's not going to be a straight line to success, but it does feel like we are on the right path because Signetti has done nothing thus far that tells you he doesn't know what he's doing.
Well, and the last thing I'll say on that, and then we'll wrap up, is that this looks like a really fun place to play football.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah,
this has been a fun team to watch. Recruits, and not
interrupt, but like something you said earlier about how much Allen had built the LEO thing. Like, this is kind of saying this is a fun place to play, and it didn't look like it from the outside. Right. And now you have this different kind of more stern approach, and kind of like, hey, we're taking this seriously, and we're going to coach you hard. And as to your point, it now looks like it's a fun place to play. You don't need to tell people it is. Sorry.
No, but that's my point. Is like the it being looking like a fun place to play. It's not just recruits, because I think recruiting while it's still very important, is not nearly as important as it used to be because of the transfer portal. And you look at what Curt Cignetti was able to do. He brought a bunch of guys in who have so far really executed well at this level. What is that looking like when you get to the next stage? When players are looking for a place to go, if you've got the NIL money, which Indiana appears to have now it's not a matter of I need to talk these players into coming and being part of this thing that isn't working yet, but we think will work if we get the right players. Now it turns into people want to come play for you.
Yeah, get on the train before we're gone.
Right, because it's already working. And it's like now you've got competition for people coming to IU. You're not having to take the scraps and hope that they fit together. And so it's what's going to make this middle part of the season. I keep saying the next 4 games. You, I think, have more accurately classified it as the next 5 games, because this 5-game stretch in the conference, if Indiana could come out of that having won 4 of those games, that would be an insane accomplishment. Even if they only come out winning 3, they will already have won 7 games in the in the season at that point. If they go 3-2 over these next 5, and I think we can sit here and look at the FPI numbers and say it would be disappointing if they only won 3 out of the next 5. But on the flip side, a 7-win season, as we have talked about many times, is not a normal occurrence in the history of IU football. Period. It's very similar to it's very similar to the 5-0 start thing, which is essentially a non-existent thing in IU history.
Well, we're breaking this up into a 5-game stretch. Everything we're adding, I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, but it's any number you said, win 3 or 4, which gets us to 8 wins. You can always tack on the next one because we still have Purdue in the bag. And it does look like, again, the bucket game thing's always crazy, but we look like a better team than Purdue, no question. So, can't guarantee wins. That game's Memorial Stadium. So it's after this 5-game stretch, if we're 7 wins or 8 wins, it's almost like you can kind of put in pencil a +1 at the end of that.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. You bring up a really good point about the Purdue game. And it's you go, if you went 2-3 over the next 5, you've still got that game at the end where statistically you're just very much better. So yeah, I'm just really fascinated to see how Indiana, against more or less equal competition from a talent perspective, fares here. And I am really curious what else Indiana's got in the bag that they haven't showed.
Yeah.
So we'll see what happens as we move forward with things. But Scott, this was a lot of fun. Love talking game. Love talking after Indiana wins. Let's keep this going as long as we possibly can. So
I feel like we're leaving some meat on the bone here with Coach Biff. There's some kind of AI chat we could do, but we'll think about that. We'll save that for next week.
I feel good about. Let's keep the focus on Indiana because that's where it should be. So
peace out, Coach Biff.
That's right. Anyway, thank you, Scott. Thank you, folks, for listening in. Be sure to sign up for the Substack, CrimsonCast.substack.com. And we'll be back later on this week. We'll have more programming around IU football as the Hoosiers get ready to host the Maryland Terrapins for Parents Weekend here in Bloomington. For the Back Home Network and for our presenting sponsor, Home Field Apparel, I'm Galen Clavio. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. Bring back the Bison. So long, everybody. And goodbye, YouTube.